The week Bridget Holloway almost fired the only man who would ever save her life started with a busted elevator and a scheduling conflict that her assistant described, without irony, as a minor inconvenience. Bridget was 33 years old, and the youngest managing director Vantage Medical Supply had appointed in its 38-year history. She ran the Vancouver office out of the 14th floor of a glass tower on Burrard Street, oversaw 61 people, and had not taken a full Saturday off since the previous October. The calendar on her second monitor looked less like a schedule and more like something that needed emergency triage. She was not a person who tolerated delays. She was also not a person who expected to spend 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning waiting for a service technician who drove a truck with a dented rear panel and a pine tree air freshener that had long since stopped smelling like anything. His name was Callum Reed. He showed up at 8:47, 13 minutes late, wearing a gray coverall with the name of a small independent repair company embroidered above the breast pocket. Strathmore Mechanical, a name that meant nothing to Bridget, who had not been the one to call him. That had been the building manager's doing. The regular contractor was booked until Thursday. Callum was available now. He was somewhere in his early 40s, Bridget guessed. The kind of face that had been weathered by something more than just outdoor work. There was a steadiness to him that she associated with people who had stopped being surprised by the world and were simply getting on with it. He carried a toolbox that looked older than the elevator itself, set it down without comment, and began assessing the panel with the particular quiet of someone who does not need to perform competence. Bridget watched him for approximately 45 seconds before she went back inside. What she did not know then, what she would not fully understand until much later, in a different context, in a conversation that would rearrange several things she had believed to be permanent, was that Callum Reed had spent 11 years as a mechanical engineer with the Department of National Defense before any of this, before the coverall, before the dented truck, before he was a man who showed up 13 minutes late to fix an elevator in a building where no one knew his last name. He had a daughter. Her name was Wren, and she was 7 years old, and she drew horses on every available surface, including, once, the back of a grocery receipt that Callum had been using to track the month's expenses. He kept that receipt. It was tucked into the sun visor of the truck. His wife, Claire, had died 22 months ago. An aneurysm, sudden and without warning, on a Wednesday afternoon in March. Callum had been in the middle of installing a compressor valve when his phone rang. He had finished the valve first. He would think about that for a long time afterward. The 11 seconds it took him to finish the valve before he answered. And eventually he would stop thinking about it, not because it stopped mattering, but because it had to. He did not talk about Claire, not to clients, not to the building manager who had hired him, not to the woman on the 14th floor who had looked at him for 45 seconds. With an expression that mixed professional impatience with something she probably didn't realize was loneliness. The elevator was not the problem he'd been called about. That became apparent within the first 8 minutes. The motor was fine. The issue was a calibration fault in the control board. Something a previous technician had misdiagnosed, probably in a hurry, probably without opening the secondary panel. Callum opened the secondary panel. He took a photograph of what he found and sent it to the building manager with a short text that said, "Previous repair was incomplete. Will fix properly. May take an extra hour." He did not charge for the extra hour. Bridget learned this later from the building manager, who mentioned it in passing the way people mention things they expect to be unremarkable. It was not unremarkable to Bridget. She filed it somewhere in the back of her mind and did not examine it until it became relevant. 3 weeks passed. Vantage Medical's distribution contract with a regional hospital network in the interior came up for renewal, and Bridget's executive director, a man named Theodore Vance, flew in from Toronto with opinions about restructuring that Bridget found both premature and strategically unsound. They had 2 meetings that left her feeling the particular exhaustion of having argued correctly and changed nothing. Her car was in the shop. A coolant leak discovered the morning of the second meeting at 7:15 a.m. when she had 40 minutes to get across town and no margin for mechanical failure. The service station had called a mobile mechanic. The mobile mechanic was Callum Reed. He was there in 22 minutes. He assessed the leak in 4. He looked up at Bridget, who was standing on the sidewalk outside her Kitsilano townhouse in a blazer and her second-best heels because the best ones were already at the office, and said, "It's not drivable today. I can get the part this afternoon, have it back to you by 5. I need it by 4, then I'll have it by 4. He had it back by 3:47. Bridget noticed that. She noticed the way he had said 4 without any visible deliberation, as if the commitment were simply a thing that would now be true. She had worked with enough contractors, vendors, and department heads to know that this quality, the ability to make a quiet promise and then quietly keep it, was rarer than it appeared. She did not say thank you in the way she usually said thank you, which was quickly and without much attention. She said it and meant it, which was different. Callum nodded and got back in the truck. She noticed as he pulled away that there was something taped to the inside of the rear window, a drawing. Crayon on white paper, the rough, confident lines of a child who was not trying to impress anyone. A horse, she thought, or possibly a dog with ambitions. The third time was not a coincidence, though it took Bridget a while to see it that way. She had been receiving emails. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that 3 of those emails, received over a period of 9 days, contained attachments that appeared to be internal. Vantage documents, supplier pricing structures, a draft of the hospital network proposal, a communication thread between Bridget and the CFO that should not have existed outside the company's encrypted server. The emails came from outside addresses that looked plausibly corporate, slight misspellings, extra characters, the kind of thing that registered as legitimate to the eye moving quickly through a full inbox. She had flagged them to IT. IT had confirmed they were external. IT had not been able to tell her how the original documents had been accessed. Bridget had been careful. She had always been careful. The documents in the emails were real, not fabricated, not partial. Someone had the actual files. She was thinking about this on a Friday morning when the building's HVAC system failed, and the 14th floor became, within 90 minutes, genuinely uninhabitable. The building manager called Strathmore Mechanical. Bridget, working from the lobby on her laptop with her coffee going cold beside her, looked up when the truck pulled into the loading bay. Callum got out with his toolbox. He saw her. He nodded once, the way people nod when they have met before but are not certain of the protocol. "Third time," Bridget said. "Building's got character," he said, and went inside. He was in the mechanical room for just over an hour. Bridget worked and thought about the emails and did not look up more than twice. When he came back through the lobby, he stopped. "Your HVAC issue was a failed damper actuator," he said. "But there's something else you should probably know." She looked up. "There's a secondary access panel in the mechanical room, the one behind the east utility wall. It's been opened recently. The dust pattern's wrong and one of the screws has fresh tool marks." He paused. "I'm not telling you there's a problem. I'm telling you someone was in there who wasn't doing HVAC work." Bridget set down her coffee. "How recent, maybe 2. "Hard to say." "How do you know the difference?" He looked at her for a moment. "Dust settles in layers," he said. "If you know what the baseline looks like, the disruption is readable. It's not complicated. It's just attention." Bridget thought about the emails. About internal documents that had left a server they weren't supposed to leave. "Can you show me?" she said. He showed her. The panel opened onto a crawl space that ran along the building's east wall and connected, at the far end, to a cable conduit that terminated 2 floors above, on 16, where Vantage Medical did not have offices, but where a commercial property management firm, with a lease renewal coming up in February, did. Callum pointed to where the conduit's junction had been modified. Not broken into, modified, professionally. Someone put a tap here, he said. Not a consumer device. The splice work is clean. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Bridget stood in the crawl space in her blazer and second-best heels and felt something recalibrate quietly inside her chest. You know what a network tap looks like, she said. It was not a question. I know what a lot of things look like, Callum said. She looked at him. The coverall, the toolbox, the way he had moved through the crawl space without hesitation, without producing his phone to light the way, as if he had been in tighter and less welcoming spaces than this. What did you do before this? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding how much to reveal, the quieter quiet of someone deciding whether to begin at all. Engineering, he said. Federal. Before my daughter was born. He didn't say more, she didn't push. But she filed it, the way she had filed the hour he hadn't charged for, and the promise he'd kept by 3:47. She called her IT director that afternoon. She also, on an instinct she did not fully justify to herself, texted the number on the Strathmore mechanical invoice and asked if Callum was available to meet the following morning. Not for a repair. She named a coffee shop on West 4th. He was there before she arrived. He had ordered nothing yet. He was reading something on his phone, and he put it away when she sat down, which was a small thing and not a small thing. The emails started 9 days after my meeting with Theodore Vance, Bridget said, without preamble. She had decided, somewhere between the building and the coffee shop, that she was going to treat this conversation as she treated the ones that mattered. Directly, without the social scaffolding she used when she wasn't sure of someone. She was not entirely sure of Callum, but she was more sure of him than she was of several people on her own floor. The files in those emails, someone had to pull them from a server that requires two-factor authentication and a VPN. IT says there's no breach on our end, which means the breach is somewhere else, or the person who pulled them didn't need to breach anything, Callum said. They had access. Bridget looked at him. Someone inside, she said, or someone who was inside long enough to set something up before they weren't. There had been an IT contractor 4 months ago, external, brought in for a server migration that had taken 6 days and had gone, according to everyone involved, smoothly. Bridget thought about this and felt the specific unpleasantness of recognizing something she should have seen earlier. The tap in the wall, she said. That's not an inside job. No, that's support. Someone on the outside, making sure the information kept flowing after the inside access was gone. He turned his coffee cup without lifting it. It's a layered operation. Whoever's behind it was patient. He looked at her steadily. Because I've seen it before. She waited. I spent 8 years doing infrastructure security assessments for national defense, he said. Before that, I was a field engineer doing the kind of work that doesn't get a lot of documentation. I left when my daughter was 2 months old. I wasn't interested in the job anymore. He said this without bitterness or performance. It was simply what had happened. Claire, my wife, she thought I should do something I could explain to Wren someday, something that wouldn't require a security clearance to talk about. He looked out the window. She wasn't wrong. Bridget said nothing for a moment. What would you do? She said. If this were your problem, document everything. Change the access credentials for anything Vance touched. Get someone to quietly examine the 16-floor lease. And don't tell your IT team anything specific until you know who's talking to whom. And the tap? Leave it for now. A removed tap tells them you found it. A tap that's still transmitting tells you what they want you to believe. Bridget looked at him for a long moment. You just told me to run a counterintelligence operation, she said. I told you to be careful in a specific sequence, he said. That's different. It wasn't really, but she understood what he meant. The next 8 days were the kind that feel, in the living of them, like a season. Bridget changed the credentials. She had a quiet conversation with the company's legal counsel, not Theodore Vance's recommendation, but her own. A woman named Phyllis, who had been with Vantage since before Bridget was hired, and who said almost nothing during the conversation, except "I see and I'll look into the floor 16 lease and don't put any of this in writing yet." Callum came back twice, once to complete a follow-up on the HVAC, which gave him legitimate access to the mechanical room. Once because Bridget called him and asked him to look at something she had found, a second access point, lower in the east wall, that she might have missed if she hadn't been looking. She had been looking because he had taught her how. The floor 16 tenant was a property management firm with offices in Calgary and Vancouver. The principal of the Calgary operation was a man named Warren Whitfield. And when Phyllis ran the full picture and put it on Bridget's desk, quietly, on a Thursday afternoon, the connection to Theodore Vance was there in the third line of the corporate registry. A shared directorship in a numbered company, 3 years old. Bridget sat with that for an evening. She called her board chair the following morning, not Theodore Vance. The board chair directly, which was outside the usual channels, and therefore the point. Ren Reed was 7 years old and had strong opinions about maple syrup, specifically, that the only acceptable quantity was more than what adults were willing to pour. She attended school in East Vancouver, and on the days her father had early calls, she was dropped off by a neighbor named June who had 3 cats and let Ren help name the newest one, which was now called Biscuit, and was unremarkable in every way except to Ren, who found it magnificent. Callum had not told Ren what he had done before Strathmore Mechanical. She knew he was an engineer. She knew he fixed things. She knew, in the way children know things that aren't explained to them, that there was a version of her father that existed before she did, a version that had been somewhere else, doing something that had made him very good at noticing what was wrong in rooms. She did not ask about it. She asked about Claire sometimes, but differently, the way you ask about weather in a season that's already passed. Callum answered those questions as honestly as he could. He had not talked to a woman the way he talked to Bridget in a long time, not because he had been closed to it, more because no one had spoken to him directly enough to require it. Bridget asked questions without softening them, and when he said something that didn't make sense to her, she said so without apology, and he found this, unexpectedly, and after 2 decades of meetings where this did not happen, restful. He did not know what to do with that. He put it where he put most things that required eventual attention and left it there. The investigation, which was what it had become, quietly and without anyone using that word in writing, came to a conclusion on a gray Tuesday in November. The board moved quickly once it had something to move on. Theodore Vance resigned before the formal meeting, which was the kind of resignation that is also a negotiation. The floor 16 lease was not renewed. The tap in the east wall was removed by a firm that Phyllis recommended, and whatever it had been transmitting was no longer transmitting. Warren Whitfield's company lost the Vantage contract it had been angling for. This was not publicly connected to anything else. It didn't need to be. Bridget stood in the 14th floor lobby. On the day the building manager confirmed the east wall had been cleared, and she felt something she did not have a clean name for. Not exactly relief. Relief is the release of a specific pressure, and this was more general than that. It was more like the sensation of a week in April when the temperature finally stays above 0 and you understand with your whole body that winter is done. She texted Callum. "It's done. Thank you," he replied after 12 minutes. "Good then." After a pause, "Ren wants to know if you like horses." Bridget looked at her phone for a moment. She thought about the drawing in the truck window. She thought about a man who had spent 8 years doing work that required clearance and had walked away from it because his wife thought he should do something he could explain to their daughter someday, and who had then, without being asked, explained something important to a woman in a lobby who had looked at him for 45 seconds and gone back inside. She typed, "I don't know much about them, but I'm open to an introduction." His response came faster this time. "She'll have opinions about that." Bridget smiled at her phone, which was not something she did often, and not something she had expected to do today. She put the phone in her pocket and walked back to her desk, where the inbox was full, and the calendar was dense, and the window behind her showed a city beginning its slow tilt toward winter. But the elevator was working, the HVAC was steady, and the wall, for the first time in months, held nothing it wasn't supposed to. Some repairs are not the ones you called for, that's the ones that count.